Today's scripture is Luke 24:13 through 35. It's the story of the road to Emmaus. Now that same day, which is going to be what we would call Easter Sunday, two of them were going to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem. They were talking with each other about everything that had happened. As they talked and discussed these things with each other, Jesus himself came up and walked along with them. But they were kept from recognizing him. He asked them, "What were you discussing together as you walk along?" They stood still, their faces downcast. One of them, named Cleopas, asked him, "Are you the only one visiting Jerusalem who doesn't know the things that have happened in these days?" "What things?" he asked. "About Jesus of Nazareth," they replied. "He was a prophet, powerful in word and deed before God and all the people. The chief priests and our rulers handed him over to be sentenced to death, and they crucified him. But we'd hoped that he was the one who was going to redeem Israel. And what's more, it's the third day since all this took place. In addition, some of our women amazed us. They went to the tomb early this morning, but they didn't find his body. They came and told us that they'd seen a vision of angels who said he was alive. Then some of our companions went to the tomb and found it was just as the women had said, but they didn't see Jesus." He said to them, "How foolish you are, and how slow to believe all the prophets have spoken. Did not the Messiah have to suffer these things and then enter his glory?" And beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he explained to them what was said in all of the scriptures concerning himself. As they approached the village to which they were going, Jesus continued on as if he were going farther. But they urged him to strongly, saying, "Stay with us, for it's nearly evening, the day is almost over." So he went in to stay with them. When he was at the table with them, he took bread, gave thanks, broke it, and began to give it to them. Then their eyes were opened and they recognized him, and he disappeared from their sight. They asked each other, "Were not our hearts burning within us when he talked with us on the road and opened the scriptures to us?" They got up and returned at once to Jerusalem. There they found the 11 and those with them, assembled them together, saying, "It's true. The Lord has risen and has appeared to Simon." Then the two told what had happened on the way and how Jesus was recognized by them when he broke the bread. Steve and I watch a lot of mysteries. I think we prefer trying to figure out who done it more than knowing who did it and then watching the detectives figure out what we already knew. The second pleasure, though, in watching a mystery is trying to figure out who's going to get whacked. After the first 5 minutes or so, we can usually figure out that since one character is so thoroughly obnoxious, it has to be him. Or at least we want it to be. Now, Steve's better at these things than I am. About halfway through the program, he'll pronounce who the murderer or the thief is. His words are, "I could write these things." And he's right. He's a lot more logical and methodical than I am. Sometimes there's so many holes you could drive a truck through it. Once he shows me how he got to whodunit, it's simply a matter of watching the drama play out. He's almost always right. And once you know the answer, it's obvious. And that seems to be the way it is with humans. Once we know and see the answer, it's always obvious. We don't typically go back and check our work, verifying each assumption and validating each step. It's obvious. It's always the thing. If you know how to do something and could do it well, it's relatively simple. It's just getting to the obvious that's the most difficult thing. Many brilliant scientific discoveries and advances were based on the obvious that no one prior to that had seen. Apples had fallen from trees well before the time of Newton. 2 unequal weights had fallen at the same speed before Galileo discovered it. Our perception of speed and movement relative to something else had always been there until Einstein pointed it out. We have a hard time seeing the obvious. The story of the walk to Emmaus takes place on the day of the resurrection. Jesus at this point has appeared to the women and to 2 of the disciples. Two men who we've not heard about prior to this in the Gospels have left Jerusalem and they're on their way to Emmaus. We don't know why they left Jerusalem or why they were going to Emmaus. We can reasonably assume that they just didn't feel like celebrating Passover in the holy city after the death of Jesus. We can also reasonably assume that they were followers of Jesus, and if not followers, at least they liked the man and his teaching and were rather disgusted with the religious authorities and the government. Personally, I don't get the sense that they were fleeing Jerusalem to escape persecution or that they were trying to hide because they were afraid. In the story, there doesn't seem to be any urgency about going to Emmaus. Rather, their business in Jerusalem is over. Maybe what had started as a pleasant vacation had ended badly. It was time to return to hearth and home and to go back and do their daily business. I'm old enough to remember when John F. Kennedy was assassinated. Well, there was a 30-day official mourning period, and while most of us were in shock, most of us were back to work or in school within a week. This didn't mean we were happy about it. It was the sad realization that life goes on with or without President Kennedy. We would do our book reports and solve our math problems. We'd learn science and geography. As kids, we would have done this regardless of who was president. You could feel the loss, but you still had everyday things that needed to be done. My grandparents had cows. They needed to be milked regardless of what was going on in the world. My sense is this is where Cleopas and his companion were. They were not happy that Jesus had died. In fact, they were quite sad. However, the metaphorical cows had to be milked and the chickens fed. They had to go home, and then this stranger joins him. Now, the power of Luke's story in telling this is that one disciple is totally unnamed, and we are invited to put ourselves into this unnamed disciple's place. Undoubtedly, they had been engaged in deep and perhaps animated conversations. If you've ever been on a bus and heard two people so thoroughly in a conversation that you want to join them simply because of the passion in their voices, or because you know they are just so wrong about this, then you'll understand. The stranger basically says, "What has gotten you guys so upset before I joined you?" I imagine it might be like asking people after a presidential election, what's going on the day after the election? People would look at you as if you were from another planet. Don't you follow the news? Are you the only one who doesn't know what has happened? Cleopas then tells the stranger about Jesus' death and about rumors that Jesus was alive. I imagine the two had been discussing the possibility of Jesus being alive and whether the women in fact had seen angels or whether such a thing was even possible. Perhaps they'd been to the crucifixion and had seen Jesus die. Perhaps they'd heard rumors that the tomb would be guarded to prevent the body from being whisked away so that the followers could claim Jesus was resurrected, or to prevent the tomb from becoming a martyr's site that the followers would rally around. There were lots of rumors swirling around, and it'd be hard to separate fact from fiction. The stranger then explained what the prophets and Moses had meant about the Messiah, and how all of this was scripturally required before the Messiah could come into his own. However, Cleopas and his companion still didn't recognize the stranger as Jesus. When they came to Emmaus, they were going to stop for the day. The stranger acted as if he was going to go on, but they stopped him and asked him to spend the night and stay for supper. It's late. How far are you going to go at this time of the day? So he stayed. It was when he took the bread, blessed it, and gave it to them that he knew it was Jesus. And then he disappeared. Taking the bread, blessing it, and giving it was that aha moment in the mystery. They saw the stranger was Jesus. His physical presence was gone as soon as they knew it was him. They then said to each other, "Weren't our hearts on fire when he spoke to us along the road and when he explained the scriptures to us?" Yes, it's easy to see the clues once you know the answer. So this poses a question about them and us. They recognized their hearts were on fire, or as Wesley would say, strangely warmed, when Jesus spoke to them. Yet they didn't connect the dots. Certainly after the blessing and breaking of the bread, it was as if Jesus took off his mask and they could see who he was. The signs and clues had been there all along. They couldn't see it, though. How often in our own trials and tribulations are we so caught up with ourselves and our feelings and emotions that we can't see the obvious, that we can't see Jesus in our lives? There are those who have the gift of proselytizing, of telling people about Jesus and salvation. It gets frustrating for them that something so transparent as Christ's love and salvation are not obvious to those they're witnessing to. What does it take for people to see Christ when it is so apparent to those who are witnessing to them? It's so clear to them. Why can't they see them? Now, many people want a burning bush experience, to know that there is a God and to accept Jesus. At least this is what they claim. The one person with the burning bush experience made every effort he could to God that God had chosen the wrong person. There's also a legend in Judaism that this burning bush had been there for a long time, but Moses was the first person to actually notice it. For Moses, the burning bush was obvious, even if he didn't want to do what the bush was telling him to do. If the rabbis were right that only Moses slowed down and paid attention to the bush, and that the bush wasn't burning, a reasonable question is how many people passed the bush and didn't notice it? We believe that Moses was chosen to lead God's people from Egypt. However, he had to read and hear the message and see the bush. We may be surrounded by burning bushes and just complain that we're hot for some reason. We may not see the burning bush or hear the call because we aren't ready. One of the most frustrating things in psychotherapy is that people run around with a bunch of bad ideas in their head about who they are. They can't hear the truth until they're at a point in their life when they're able to hear it. The ground has to be laid. Most of us are not going to have flaming shrubbery talk to us to know where God needs to send us. This isn't to say it's impossible, but more commonly God comes to us in different ways. Perhaps it's waking up one morning to realize your life would be so much worse off without God than with him. Perhaps there's a calm certainty that you're protected and in his hands. There's a beauty in the fact that the two strangers recognized Jesus in the taking of the bread. They're 3 days out from the Last Supper, wherein Jesus broke the bread and shared the cup and asked his disciples to remember him. Jesus broke the bread for the 3,000 and the 5,000 in the miracle of the loaves and fishes. In physically feeding his followers, he spiritually was feeding them as well. The travelers, on realizing they'd seen Jesus, left Emmaus immediately and returned to Jerusalem and told the disciples, who were hiding and had not yet seen Jesus, that they'd broken bread with him. The disciples were told by women, Simon and the other disciple, and now travelers from Emmaus, that Jesus was alive. There were several witnesses to Jesus' resurrection, and yet that same evening, Jesus appeared to the disciples and showed them his wounds. 8 days later, he would appear to Thomas, who by then had heard from the other disciples and the women about Jesus' resurrection. He needed proof, though, in spite of the witnesses. And we thank God for Thomas, since he asks the questions that those of us who've never seen Jesus in the flesh, he asks the questions so we don't have to. And he is also the first disciple to testify that Jesus is the Lord after the resurrection. Thomas, who spent all of his time with Jesus and had professed willingness to die for him when he was determined to go to Jerusalem, wasn't yet ready to believe. The travelers weren't yet ready to believe, nor the disciples when they first came to the empty tomb. It isn't surprising that we may be reluctant to believe, particularly when we haven't had a road to Emmaus experience. We're rational human beings. We cannot see until we're ready to see. We cannot hear until we're ready to hear. We cannot believe until we're ready to believe. We may never have a road to Emmaus experience or see a burning bush. However, we may realize that God is with us in the world and be willing to experience God with us. Let's open our hearts to the possibility. Amen.